introduction to Megan Kenworthy, who has a master's in hydrology from Boise State, and Taylor Dudunake who has a master's from the Water Resources grad program up here in Moscow. And Taylor, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you guys, and just thanks again for being here and being our presenters today.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you guys hear us okay?
We can.
Okay. Let's see. Let me get our screen shared here. Help me out that. So you got us all set up here. All right, can you guys see our presentation too now?
Yeah, looks good.
Cool. All right, thanks. Good morning. So we're going to be talking about results from 3 recent publications that Taylor and I have worked on. All of them are related to outcomes from some of the large scale restoration work that has been taking place on the Kootenai River. And although Taylor and I are presenting these findings, we want to acknowledge that there are many other USGS staff that collected a lot of the data that was used in these studies. So that data collection was instrumental in making these studies possible. And in addition, we want to acknowledge the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho, which has been leading these restoration efforts. So, a quick overview of the talk. Before we dive into the results, we're going to take you through some history and background about the Kootenai River, so it will set us up well for understanding the questions in these 3 studies. Then we're going to go over highlights from 3 of these recent papers. The first one is going to be looking at how restoration treatments changed flow depths and velocities and fine sediment loading. Second one, we're going to be looking at the success of some substrate enhancement that was geared towards improving sturgeon spawning. And finally, we're going to take a quick look at how sturgeon are using the straight reach after the restoration work. And hopefully from there, we'll have some time for some questions. So first off, we'll start with the study area. Get my laser pointer here. The Kootenai River is a little confusing because it crosses the boundary between the US and Canada a couple times. It starts out, it follows this red line. It starts out in Canada, flows south into Montana, heads over through northern Idaho, back up into Canada, and then finally joins the Columbia River. Along the course, the river changes character, the morphology changes pretty drastically. So up near the headwaters, it's a steeper channel, coarse substrate. From there, the river flows into Lake Kootenai, which is a funny combination of Kootenai, Canada, and USA. And Lake Kootenai is the reservoir formed by Libby Dam. From there, downstream of Libby Dam, the river flows through the Canyon Reach, which is more confined and steep. Near Moye, the town of, or the tributary, confluence with the Moye River, the river comes out of the Canyon Reach and it hits this broad, kind of unconfined valley, and it enters the Braided Reach, where it's often a multi-threaded channel. It's still coarse substrate, but there's islands. The character changes here. And as you move downstream in the Braided Reach, the slope of the river also decreases. Then down near the town of Bonners Ferry, we have a short transition reach called the Straight Reach, transitions between the Braided and the Meander Reach. The river moves into the Meander Reach, and just like the name says, it's meandering single thread river through a very low gradient valley. Eventually, it flows into Kootenai Lake. And after exiting Kootenai Lake, the Kootenai River joins the Columbia. This is a closer view of some of these reaches we just talked about. We've got the Braided, the Straight, and part of the Meander Reach. And we'll be focusing on these areas from here on out. One thing I want to note with this slide is this complicated interaction in the Straight and Braided reaches between the discharge coming in and the backwater effect of Kootenai Lake downstream. Typically, the extent of the backwater is somewhere in the vicinity of Bonners Ferry. It can go as high as the town of Crossport. The greatest extent is usually during the spring freshet. And we want to keep this backwater in mind because it has implications for things like sediment mobility, flow depths and velocities, and how easily fish can move upstream through these reaches. Now we'll kind of transition to a quick overview of some of the history of the watershed and the river, and some of the anthropogenic impacts that have resulted in the need for these restoration efforts. First off, in the early 1900s, a couple of dams were built near the outlet of Kootenai Lake, in particular Coralin Dam, which was completed in 1931, raised the lake elevation, the water surface elevation of Kootenai Lake. And again, keeping that backwater in mind has implications for the extent and effect of the backwater up in straight braided reaches. In addition, starting in the 1890s, levees were constructed along the river, particularly through the Meander Reach, where it's low gradient, it's good agricultural land, and the low-lying areas out in the floodplain. So the levees were helping to prevent flooding of these low-lying areas and allowing this agricultural development to happen. However, the levees also constricted the flow of the river and drastically reduced the ability of the river to spread out over the historic floodplain and into side channels or other off-channel habitats. This also reduced deposition of fine sediment on the floodplain. Despite the levees, there were still some pretty large and damaging floods that impacted communities and the ag land. Here's some photos from an event in 1929, which registered about 50,000 CFS near Leonia. Got a house flooded out there. And another event in 1948 that flooded out the town of Bonners Ferry. And it looks like discharge in that one got up over 100,000 CFS. In response to these flooding events, Libby Dam was constructed at the location of this star over in Montana. It was completed in 1972, again forming Lake Kootenai upstream. And as we're all familiar with, the completion of this dam had a number of impacts, some of which are listed on this slide. In particular, it impacted the stream flow magnitude and timing, and downstream and lake stage downstream. So these two figures highlight some of these changes. The top is discharge at Leonia. The bottom is stage at Bonners Ferry. And in both, the blue line shows the daily mean discharge or stage before Libby Dam. And the purple and red lines show the daily mean stage or discharge after Libby Dam for two different operational conditions. The main thing to note is the significant reduction in discharge and stage during the peak of that spring freshet, and then an artificially elevated stage and discharge in other times of the year. Some of the other impacts included changes in the water temperature regime, changes to the sediment supply and the capacity of the river to move sediment, and as we already mentioned, this lack of floodplain interaction and an increase of fine sedimentation within the main channel. So again, this is going to highlight that the river is not interacting with the floodplain in the way it used to before Libby Dam was constructed. This is an example from Mirror Lake and Fry Lake. We have a USGS topo map from 1911 showing this location. These lakes are now either agricultural land or a golf course because the river is no longer interacting with the floodplain here. It's just important to keep this in mind when thinking about the ecological response to levees and dams. And we also want to highlight here that the current restoration efforts that the Kootenai Tribe is continuing with are focused on some of these off-channel areas. They're making efforts to restore tributaries where they can and recreate the connection of the river to these side channels and other historic floodplain areas such as Deep Creek. So there were a number of unforeseen impacts resulting from flow regulation and levees and other anthropogenic changes. Of note was the collapse of numerous fisheries. There's a rapid decline, in particular in Kootenai River white sturgeon, burbot, and others. We want to focus a little more on the white sturgeon here. This fish is not only culturally significant to the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho, it seems that it's also often the focus of a lot of the restoration work. The restoration goal was to restore the entire ecosystem, but it seems that when a lot of the analyses of results seem to focus on outcomes related to these fish, to sturgeon. The Kootenai River white sturgeon are an isolated population. They've been isolated since the last ice age between Kootenai Falls and Bonington Falls. Generally, the fish are hanging out in Kootenai Lake, and when it's time to spawn, they will swim upriver to spawn. There's uncertainty regarding their historic spawning locations. It's not exactly known. At present, they tend to spawn at some locations in the Meander Reach, but they're doing this over a substrate that is too fine, and it tends to smother the eggs. There has been some mitigation in these locations, and Taylor's going to present some of those results. There's been no natural recruitment of these fish since the 1970s, and as a result, they were listed as endangered in 1994. And we should mention too that despite no natural recruitment, the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho is operating a hatchery to support this population. So in response to the fisheries collapse and these other impacts, the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho has led these restoration efforts. In 2009, they released this document, this master plan that would outline the goals for the restoration efforts. The overall goal was to improve the entire Kootenai River ecosystem. Treatments so far have been constructed within the main channel over about 55 miles of the river in the Braided, Strait, and Meander Reaches. This construction done between 2012 and 2018. And as we already mentioned, the ongoing restoration efforts are now focusing on the off-channel habitat. We want to cover a couple of the sturgeon-specific restoration goals here. One of them, first off, was to improve substrate in the Meander Reach where the fish are known to spawn. They also wanted to encourage spawning in the more suitable substrates that are available up in the Braided Reach. To do this, they wanted to increase flow depths and create a sort of pool ladder system that might encourage sturgeon to move upstream into the Braided Reach to spawn. They also wanted to increase egg survival with the goal of increasing flow velocities on the falling limb of the spring freshet to keep eggs clear of fine sediment, and also just overall reducing the input of fine sediment. I'm going to move through some of these slides kind of fast, but I just want to show some examples of some of the treatments that were constructed. I think that the pictures are just interesting too, because it really shows the scale of this work. This is a large river, and I don't think we see necessarily a lot of restoration efforts at this scale. First off, we have bank stabilization and regrading, and the red stars, if I didn't say this already, highlight some of the locations where this work has taken place. A number of pools were also excavated to try to increase flow depths and help create that pool ladder. In conjunction with the pools that were excavated, these pool forming structures were created along the banks that are supposed to help scour and maintain the pools. And then also in a number of locations, the substrate was enhanced. Within the Strait Reach, these clusters of boulders were put in, and kind of this configuration that you can see here to try to provide more diverse hydraulics. And then in the Meander Reach at Shorty's Island and Myrtle Bend, we had coarser substrates added to the locations where sturgeon have been spawning. The USGS over the years has collected a lot of data in support of the restoration work, but I just wanted to throw these pictures up here because the USGS has also been collecting data in general, doing research in general in the Kootenai River, going back over 100 years. Some of the work that the USGS did in support of these more recent restoration efforts were topographic and bathymetric surveys, sediment transport monitoring and sediment mapping, stream gauge operation to measure stage, discharge, and create sediment surrogate models for suspended sediment, and also development of 2D hydraulic model IRIC FastMech that was used to investigate potential restoration plans. This work has also produced a lot of other rich data sets that we used for these studies that we're going to be talking about here, and then a lot of publications that it's just a great data set. I encourage you to investigate if you're interested in it. Okay, so that's the end of the background. We'll move into some of the results from the first of the 3 studies. This one was just published in September. It used a lot of the great USGS data sets to look at impacts of the restoration treatments in the braided and straight reaches. In particular, it was focused on looking at changes in flow depths. One of the restoration goals was having 60% of reach area greater than 5 meters deep. Also looking at the success of creating a pool ladder, looking at how velocities may have increased on the falling limb of the spring freshet. Again, goal here was to have 60% of reach area with velocities over 1 meter per second. And then also investigating if restoration work impacted fine sediment being input into the reach. To do this analysis, we used the 2D hydraulic model, IRIC FastMech. It was used in a lot of other USGS studies on the Kootenai, so we have a lot of previous models to start with for calibrating for this study. The model domain extended from near the below Moye gauge down to tribal hatchery gauge. And we had a lot of years of topobathy surfaces, and we did run the model for all these years, but we've distilled the analysis down to a few years just to simplify the comparisons. We used the topobathy surface from 2011 to represent channel morphology before restoration treatments were built. The surface from 2020 was used to represent the channel post-restoration. 2020 was the first year we had a survey in which all the features had been constructed. And then we also took a look at 2022, which was the last year the channel was surveyed, or we have survey data for, to see if we could discern anything about continued direction of change. Using the model, we ran 3 different flow conditions that are shown in this table. 2 of them used what's considered a bank full discharge with Libby Dam in operation. It's about 30,000 CFS. And they differed by the downstream lake stage. One had a higher stage, one had a lower stage. And then we ran a recession flow condition. It's supposed to simulate sort of typical conditions on the recession limb of that spring freshet. When it came to analyzing the results from these model runs, we focused in on this section of the channel, because this is where most of the treatments were constructed. And we defined these 3 sub-reaches to help us just help with the analysis. This was the Triple Meanders sub-reach, Bonners Ferry Island, and then the Straight Reach. And also looking at the results from the bank full simulations, we were focused on depth because restoration goals included increasing depth during that spring freshet. And then for the recession simulation, we focused on velocity results because restoration goals included increasing flow velocities on the falling limb of the spring freshet. So moving into some highlights from the results here. Both of these figures are showing flow depths from the bank full simulation with a higher downstream stage. The map is showing simulated depths for 2011, so pre-restoration, and 2020 is post-restoration. And I've highlighted a couple of areas where you can see there were some definite increases in flow depths. The bar chart is showing median flow depths on the left, and then the percentage of reach area with flow depth greater than 5 meters. And this is broken out by subreach and the full study reach, and then the colors are showing the year, so 2011, 2020, and 2022. The key points from this depth analysis or analysis of depths was that from 2011, 2020, we did see a small increase in flow depths, but the results aren't quite reaching that 60% of reach area with depths greater than 5 meters. But we did see improvements. From 2020 to 2022, the bar chart is suggesting that there was some loss of deeper areas. Maybe some of these pools are starting to fill in a bit. Related to flow depths, we took a look at pool extent. This is again for the bank full high stage flow condition. And the map is showing the pre-restoration extent of pools, which are highlighted in pink, and post-restoration pools, again highlighted in pink. And the table is showing pool area, volume, and the average distance between pools for each year simulated. We defined pools just very simply by highlighting areas that were greater than 5 meters in depth. And the main takeaway here is that from 2011 to 2020, we did see a sizable increase in pool area and volume, and a decrease in the distance between pools. So this points to some pretty good success in creating that pool ladder to help sturgeon move upstream. Similar to flow depths, though, we did see there was a slight decline in pool area and volume from 2020 to 2022, again, indicating that pools might be filling in a little bit. Take a look now at some of the velocity results. Again, these are for the recession flow condition. The right side is showing pre-restoration velocities and post-restoration velocities, and you can see some areas with some increases. However, we also see areas with decreases in velocity. This bar chart is like the previous bar charts with median velocities on the left and reach area with velocities greater than 1 meter per second. Looking at the study reach as a whole, we actually saw a decrease in the median velocity and a decrease in the reach area with velocities greater than 1 meter per second. The results are a little more mixed when you take a look at, when you break it out by subreach. Changes from 2020 to 2022 are pretty small overall. Last thing we'll highlight from the study is taking a look at fine sediment to see if we wanted to take a look at if whether restoration treatments seem to be reducing fine sediment inputs to this study reach. To do this, we looked at suspended sediment records from 2 stream gauges between 2006 and 2023. They bracket the reach, they're shown here. It was important to include this upstream gauge to determine if any trends we detected were something happening upstream of the reach or something happening within the reach itself. We looked at total and fine and sand concentrations, and we did trend analysis at both sites after we accounted for the influence of tributary discharge. I'm not going to go into the details of the statistical analysis that we use, but basically we were looking for statistically significant temporal trends in the measured concentrations after we accounted for the tributary discharge. We were interested in accounting for tributary discharge because after Libby Dam was constructed, tributaries became the main source of fine sediment for this reach. This table is highlighting the main results from that part of the analysis. The main takeaway was that we did see statistically significant temporal trends at both sites, upstream and downstream, in the total fine and sand concentrations. We saw reductions in fine sediment. The reductions were similar at both sites, upstream and downstream, suggesting that what was actually going on is there was a reduction in sediment supply entering the study reach rather than the restoration work itself reducing entrainment of fine sediment in the study reach. There have been a number of other restoration projects in tributaries upstream that could have contributed to this result that we're seeing here. So real quick, some of the key takeaways. Overall, we did see an increase in flow depths, though it was small. There was considerable success in creating this pool ladder that could help sturgeon move upstream. Our velocity results were mixed, but there were improvements in some of the sub-reaches. One of the key things that's sort of interesting to us is changes from 2020 to 2022 suggest that deeper areas might be filling in, but it's difficult to know if this is actually the direction of change or if this is just within the year-to-year variability. We would need additional years of monitoring and surveying to dive into that question more. And overall, the analysis of suspended sediment shows that there is a reduction in incoming sediment supply. So from there, I'm going to hand it off to Taylor, and he's going to talk about the next two studies. I guess we'll save questions for the end.
Yeah, so Megan's, I think, really highlighted well some of the work that's been done upstream in the Braided Reach. And obviously there's going to be biological implications of the results from her study, but the sediment loading itself is something that we studied a lot, and we also looked at it specifically in the Straight Reach, which is just downstream of where Megan was talking about, right here near Bonners Ferry, and then we moved downstream to Myrtle Bend and Shorty's Island. So the substrate enhancement pilot project began basically looking in locations where it was believed to be a suitable location for spawning based off of the substrates, specifically the Straight Reach. It's a transition zone, as Megan highlighted, that basically goes from coarse gravels into more fine sediments like that produce dunes. We see a lot of sand dunes beginning right near, it's called ambush rock, and persisting all the way downstream to Kootenai Lake. But specifically at Myrtle Bend and Shorty's Island, there's some interesting things happening there. As we can see, they're both sort of on the outside bend of those meanders. And actually what we also see there are some outcrops of clay. So obviously very fine, but they're not getting necessarily, there's no sands that are filling in on top of those necessarily. So that was always believed to be a suitable location for sturgeon spawning. But there wasn't many coarse substrates. So what the whole idea behind the substrate enhancement pilot project was to place more coarse substrates in at these locations and hopefully recruit the sturgeon from downstream into these suitable spawning locations and hopefully have successful spawning events. Some of you guys might know that sturgeon are actually broadcast spawners. So when they release their eggs, they end up drifting downstream. Well, when they drift, they basically will latch on to whatever they run into. And if it's fine sediments, then ultimately they become smothered, lose oxygen, and the recruitment of sturgeon throughout the year is poor. But if they latch on to these coarser substrates, the interstitial species allow for nutrients and oxygen to move through them and basically keep those eggs rejuvenated. So ultimately, if the whole hypothesis was if we place suitable substrates in these locations, then the sturgeon will come. And so doing that, we monitored these locations in a few different ways. Beginning right after construction, well, before construction, we did some bathymetric monitoring, getting very high resolution data that looked at the surface where the substrates would be placed. And then throughout the construction of these SEP sites, and then after the construction, we also did surveys, both before and after spring freshets. We also did some velocity mapping in this area, looking at the distribution of velocities, both depth averaged and whatnot, throughout the cross section of the channel, both on top of the substrate enhancement pilot projects, downstream, upstream, and everything. Additionally, we just dropped a very high-tech GoPro. Some of you guys might recognize this as a substrate or as a sediment sampler, but it also is a dual-purpose underwater camera. It turns out dropping cameras into some very deep water with fast-flowing water isn't necessarily the easiest thing or safest thing. So dropping a heavy weight was our next best option with a couple cameras mounted on it. And as I mentioned, we did these surveys, both the bathy mapping, velocity mapping, and underwater camera throughout a long duration of time, and both before and after the spring freshet, to try to home in on what's happening with the substrates. Are they staying clean of those fine sediments, or are they starting to fill in? So it's basically just a monitoring effort at these sites. And we looked at it both on an interannual and an intra-annual. So you'll notice on the right image, there's kind of a rubbly surface, and those are actually the piles of precisely placed substrates. We're talking, cobbles and some boulders in these areas. And that was basically the location that we really wanted to keep our eyes on and see if it was filling in or not. So just a couple examples on the left from our underwater photos of what's happening at the site. And generally speaking, they're staying clean, right? And we sort of expect that with those outside meander bends. And so that's somewhat proving as a success. But really, what's the metric of success here? Is it filling in? And if so, how much? Is it a thickness that's making it such that the substrates are completely not protruding from the bed, or are they fully exposed to flow? And those are things that we did using various analyses, using basically the bathy data, the multi-beam bathymetry data that we collected throughout time. So the net volume, this is an interannual comparison, but the net volume, basically, we had to threshold it a little bit just because of the uncertainty in the bathy data itself. But basically a lowering of volume to the tune of 68 cubic meters, and a raising of 290, and then the total thickness difference basically between these dates was negligible, less than about 10 centimeters, right? Of additional sediment piling in on these, but that's given the size of the cobbles, it was relatively negligible. And this is kind of just a DM of difference, if you will, of locations where fill is occurring versus erosion, deposition versus erosion. And then moving more into an intra-annual, so before and after your freshet. These are just a couple images of the same date, nonetheless, of underwater photos, but they're staying pretty dang clean. And this is at Myrtle Bend, so located further upstream. But yeah, generally speaking, the substrates are staying pretty clean, and the difference in the volume, the thickness, and the total volume itself, relatively negligible given the uncertainty in the data, the bathy data itself. Again, another DEM of difference at this site. So yeah, we see a little bit of erosion just on this intra-annual basis, but over a longer term, they're just staying clean, and that's essentially a success metric of success for these SEP sites. I didn't mention the upstream location in the Straight Reach, but this is just another example of the fact that not all substrates are necessarily created equal, right? We have some Detroit riprap on the left, also known as farmer throwing cars off the bank, and this is in the Braided Reach. But one of the targets for the restoration work in the Braided Reach, remove anthropogenic debris and place more suitable spawning substrates. So moving more into the physical habitat and the biological implications of these different treatments. And this is a screen capture of the front page of a recent SIR, Scientific Investigation Report, back in 2017. And you'll kind of notice some bowling pin features. And that this is one of the other SEP sites. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, but we followed up on the 2017 study and included some additional data that we had acquired from Idaho Fish and Game. and did more of a physical habitat modeling study, looking at the suitability of the habitat in the Straight Reach, since that is more of this transition zone where more suitable substrates are believed to exist. So again, those bowling pin features, very strategically placed rock clusters, coarser substrates, and then those are located just downstream of this, what we've kind of considered a gravel wedge. And through time, this gravel wedge has slowly been propagating downstream and starting to encroach on these substrate clusters. But nonetheless, this Straight Reach is instrumented with some high precision, high accuracy acoustic telemetry transponders, and basically what those are doing are listening to fish that are passing through the reach and identifying with precision where those fish are located throughout the cross section and with depth as well. And so that was the purpose of the study, was to figure out what conditions and where are these fish hanging out. And so it turns out these sturgeon, which are they're tagged with pit tags, and we've got a big population of fish that are tagged male, female, juvenile, etc. And it turns out those fish are pretty preferential to where they're hanging out. And this is just kind of a heat map, if you will, of the number of fish that are existing on a 3-meter basis. But of course, tons and tons of data are indicative of the fact that perhaps deeper water, slower velocities, and that's kind of where these fish are hanging out. And so, as I mentioned, we had a 2017 data set along with 3 other data sets that came in after 2020. And these plots essentially indicate or give us an idea of how stage is changing through time on the right axis, or right y-axis. And then additionally, we have some occurrences of the fish. So each of these horizontal lines or these points are indicative of a specific fish individual. And these fish individuals have different names, 87, 308, et cetera. That means nothing to you, but essentially what's happening is these all are different individuals, and I forgot the legend on this, unfortunately, but one color represents females that are of spawning, believed to be spawning capable, which essentially we narrowed those in on fish that we saw move from Kootenai Lake all the way downstream and make a spawning run all the way upstream into near the Braided Reach. Additionally, there's other fish that are more residential to the riverine environment as opposed to living down in the lake and moving all the way up. So we excluded those from the analysis that I'll talk about here in a minute. But additionally, we have males and juveniles as well within this population. So you'll see that kind of when one fish shows up, they kind of all start to follow suit, right? 417 seems to be a pretty persistent individual. And really loves to hang out in the Straight Reach. So we also have the hydraulic model data that Megan mentioned, and the hydraulic model, you know, it's a curvilinear grid with basically estimated depths and velocities at the model grid nodes, and then we have a sturgeon that lives within that cell, that voxel, right? And so we can start to home in on what velocity or what depth occurs within this area where the sturgeon exists at any given time. These fish are dynamic, right? They're always moving, and so is water moving downhill. So pairing those depths and velocities with the XY position of the fish is also one of the tasks that we performed in this study. One of the bigger assumptions that we also made was the fact that sturgeon tend to live on the bottom of the river. So we made the assumption that wherever the fish is located in the XY location, whatever the depth is, that's where the fish was living. Now, in reality, maybe that fish was starting to come up within the water column. But again, as I mentioned, generally speaking, these sturgeon live at the bottom. And also one of the other points of the hydraulic model is it is a quasi 3D model, but we essentially use the results from the 2D output. So we assumed, or we used the 2D outputs. So essentially depth averaged velocity. So yeah, it might be slower at the bottom and faster at the top, but nonetheless, we averaged the depths, or the velocities rather, and assigned that to the position of the fish. And so these four plots rather, they give us an idea of what's available in this reach. So from the model outputs, what are the depths and velocities and the distributions of those depths and velocities through time. And we see basically two different distributions, right, of the available data and what's actually selected. So the left side of these four plots are unknown spawning status. So again, those are the fish that we don't believe are making a spawning run. And then we have the fish on the right side that are spawning capable females. Again, those are the fish that we actually observed through the telemetry data moving from downstream near the lake all the way upstream into the straight reach. And this is believed to be a spawning run. Of course, we're hydrologists, we're not biologists, but we did get some great input from our co-authors who are both from the Fish and Game biologists and then the Canadian ministry who does a lot of work with this telemetry data. So we felt very confident in what we felt were spawning capable females. But again, these distributions are pretty telling in the fact that, well, they're choosing a lot deeper water than what's generally available throughout the straight reach. And for the velocities, however, they're choosing slower velocities within the straight reach compared to what the general distribution of velocities are throughout the reach. So from there, there is, that plot is not supposed to be on top. We developed some habitat suitability index curves or distributions. Sorry, guys. We developed habitat suitability indices. So basically, of the distribution of depths and velocities, we suggested that if more fish are occurring in the 8-meter range that are spawning, or fish that are existing in the, say, 0.3 to 0.5 meters per second range, those are considered more suitable locations, right? And so basically what we did was we developed composite habitat suitability curves. So for every location within the model domain, we developed the composite habitat suitability index value for that location, and then started to compute a weighted usable area for the entire hydrograph. And that's what was supposed to be seen right here. And so with 4 different hydrographs, 2017, 18, 19, 20, which were the 4 years that we had observed fish data, we see that, during the freshet, the weighted usable area, or the total area that's believed to be more suitable, is better because the water's deeper, right? And the velocities actually tend to be a little bit slower because of the backwater from Kootenai Lake that Megan mentioned. So slower velocities, deeper water, it's considered to be better based off of what we observed in the fish behaviors. And then we went ahead and moved forward with 2022. So although we didn't have observed fish data for 2022 during this study, we still performed the hydraulic analysis on this reach. And then based off of the distribution of depths and velocities that were modeled, we basically forecasted how good the habitat would be for spawning sturgeon. And again, we see that during that freshet period, the suitability is presumably pretty good. There's a whole bunch of details within this study that I didn't have time to go into, but I do want to acknowledge, of course, everybody that was involved with this study, and the many studies that have happened on the Kootenai River, and not just to mention the agencies, but also the people. We've been fortunate enough to work with a lot of amazing people. Molly Wood, she's on this call. It looked like I saw her name on there. She's one of them. So without the data that was collected by those fine folks, a lot of these studies and these insights that have been gleaned from our studies just in the last couple of years wouldn't have been possible. So with that, I think we want to open it up to some questions.
All right, thanks, folks. We can go ahead and take questions in the chat. And actually, I noticed there's also one in a Q&A box, which I tend to miss. So I'll just jump into the first one. I don't know if you can see that, Taylor and Megan. First one here. Yeah, it's in the Q&A. So, what are the ideal conditions for sturgeon? Also, what kinds of fish, animals, wildlife in general have been positively impacted by the restoration project?
Yeah, so I'm going to start off with Carol's question in the Q&A. So her question was, as you just pointed out, what are the ideal conditions for sturgeon, and what other kind of fish, animals, wildlife in general have been positively impacted by the restoration projects? So ideal conditions, I sort of just highlighted that a little bit. The deeper water, right? That's what the fish suggest that they like better. Now, it's a question of is it because that's the only thing that's available, and is there some sort of bottleneck that's occurring in the straight reach? Perhaps, and that's not to say that fish aren't moving upstream. There is some telemetry data that does suggest that the fish are, in fact, moving into the braided reach, not necessarily hanging out there as long, but they do hang out. They do poke their nose up in there, and ideally, that's the whole hope, is to get those fish up into those conditions where it's deeper in those pools, and deeper water means generally slower water. They're guarded by hydraulic structures, and they can hang out and rest and feed and also spawn. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit. But what other kind of fish and animals have benefited from this? There's all sorts of downstream effects between the trout species, the burbot, the
Burbot, I think, have been a particular success story.
the burbot are huge, and
we haven't been as involved with any of the burbot work, but my understanding is that their population has been responding more favorably to these efforts. I would highlight that one for sure.
Totally, it's a whole ecosystem, right? So I mean, it's like the Jungle Book. When you go out onto the Kootenai River, you see almost everything, whether it's bald eagles duking it out with ospreys because there's a nice trout down in Deep Creek, or there's some frog, a lot of frog focused studies happening on Deep Creek. Obviously, a lot of migratory bird studies happening with the Kootenai River Wildlife Refuge up there. So these all have implications, and it's an ecosystem, right? So we'll jump over to the messages. So Brittany has a question. Do you expect the recent pool infilling to be temporary? Talk about one.
Yeah, so the question is, do you expect the recent pool infilling to be temporary, or might it indicate a longer term trend in sediment deposition? That's a great question. One we're asking ourselves. It's without additional years of monitoring data, I don't think we can really say whether it is a trend that's going to continue, or if it's just within the year-to-year variability or the variability you expect between surveys. And I think that result really highlights the need for, with any restoration project, ongoing monitoring so that you can understand what did and didn't work, and maybe how to change course if you continue with additional work, or how results might apply to other similar systems.
It's a dynamic system, right? So I've had the fortunate opportunity to see a lot of change in the Braided Reach specifically, and some of the restoration work that's occurred. But I do recall one year, it was just before they started constructing one of the big spurs, the pool forming structures up in the middle meander, the triple meanders I think you mentioned. And before they built it, we did a pre-built survey using a multi-beam sonar. And hydraulic models, sediment transport models, were indicating that, if we dig out this location, there's a pretty dang good chance that it's going to fill back in. And unsurprisingly, we turned back around 1 year later after they constructed it over the fall, and this pool that they had dug out in coordination with the spur, the pool forming structure, it was 15 feet deep at one point. Well, not quite 15, it's deeper than 15, but essentially what happened over the course of 1 year is about 13 feet of sediment filled into this hole just over the course of one season. So extremely dynamic. Was that an effect of upstream restoration work, the pool forming structure upstream? Was it scouring out the bed and depositing further downstream in this location that I just mentioned? Perhaps. But that's just over the course of 1 year, and without continued monitoring, it's hard to really say exactly what's going to happen. Ethan's got another question there about what tools are we using? Well, we have the great fortune again to have a multi-beam sonar, and that's been kind of our bread and butter for over 15 years now. And that's just been the tool that we've used for doing very high resolution bank to bank coverage. And this isn't
In the water.
Yeah, in the river specifically. And this isn't just 1 point per meter. This is hundreds of points per square meter. So we're really getting down to the details of the bed and able to really track the geomorphic changes throughout the reach. And what other instruments have been used? Well, there's been topography LiDAR that Megan mentioned. That's been flown, I think, a handful of times since the onset of this project. The most recent being in 2017. So they did use a green LiDAR that penetrated a lot of the Braided Reach, given the conditions for which they flew it. It was relatively low flow conditions, ideal water conditions, very clear. So they're able to do a really good job at overlapping the topobathy LiDAR with our bathy data. Now, once they move farther downstream, there's a little more limitations with the capabilities of that topobathy LiDAR. But again, that's why we have the multi-beam sonar. We were able to go in and fill it in and create a pretty dang continuous data set. So
I just want to ask a really quick follow-on. Do you know, Taylor, how deep the green LiDAR penetrates with current technology?
With the current technology, it's your favorite answer. It depends, right? The turbidity of the water is going to be your biggest driver, along with aeration or turbulence in the water. But on the Kootenai River, downstream where they were able to get into some deeper water, I think it was around the 2.5, 3 meter range, or the signal was no longer. But they also ran into macrophytes, right? So there's the trouble of, well, was it the turbidity or was it the macrophytes? But some of the new sensors that are coming out, both for fixed wing mounted sensors, drone sensors, they're really starting to push the limits. So I expect, I'll be out of a job. I'm not going to be able to be multi-beaming anymore. I'm going to have satellites flying above me collecting full coverage bathy data. I hope that's not the case, but man, you never know these days.
Yeah. And also, does anybody in Boise have questions? I know you guys, sometimes it's a little harder to jump in. Or if there's another classroom or conference room out there. Anybody here? All right. Just see if any more filter in.
Yeah, we're pretty easy to get a hold of. Unfortunately, I didn't put our email addresses up here, but yeah, I think search our names, and we're easy enough to get a hold of, and happy to chat shop about the Kootenai River or many of the other things that our office and our colleagues do here in Boise. We are fortunate to work with a strong group of people, and we've persevered through a lot this year, but we're holding strong and still doing some great science. So we love to communicate with the public and let the people know what we do and why we do it.
Great. Thanks, folks. Yeah, hang in there. And yeah, really interesting to learn more about this whole system.
Thank you.
Oh, hey, we got one other quick one just came in. Don't hang up yet. There's a question saying, how long do you expect the project to continue?
It's a good question. Oh, that's in the Q&A. Okay. Well, unfortunately, for us, for the habitat monitoring work, that ended a couple years ago now. So we're kind of just waiting for that call from our colleagues up in North Idaho to say, hey, we need to get your boat in with your multi-beam or what have you. But there's also tons of other work that our colleagues specifically are doing, more ecosystem focused, water quality. The Kootenai River is a hotbed for a lot of water quality issues stemming from upstream influences. So that is work that is happening, and it's in the infancy stage, I would say. And so that's a great thing. I think that the habitat monitoring work will ebb and flow with time. We try to make it known that you can't really gauge the success of a habitat restoration project without continued monitoring. So that's our shameless plug for let's get more data, right? But we'll see what happens.
Great. All right. Well, thanks again. And for the folks who are still online, we will see you again next August with the next round of the seminar series. We're always looking for more suggestions or people to give presentations. So if anybody out there has any folks or topics they'd like to see, let us know. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.